people that have written and experienced the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement, which was an incredibly important time in U.S. history. And honestly, it's very important today. So I think today you're going to learn a lot of important things. This is Paul Murray. Paul is a professor emeritus at sociology at Siena College in Lundyville, New York, where he taught for 36 years before retiring in 2016. He's a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement. His teaching and research is focused on race relations and civil rights. He has published a series of scholarly articles on Catholic activists in the modern civil rights movement. These articles have won awards from the American Catholic Historical Association. Paul's currently working on a book, Seeing Jesus in the Eyes of the Oppressed, a history of Franciscans working for peace and justice. Let's welcome Paul. Bill Wernz has practiced law in the fields of legal and judicial ethics for the last 40 years. He was a director of the Minnesota Lawyers Board and chair of the Minnesota Board of Judicial Standards. Bill is the author of the online reference work, Minnesota Legal Ethics. Before his career as a lawyer, Bill taught religious studies at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana.
Cotter alum.
Well, we're about to get to that.
Okay.
All right. Bill's work in the civil rights movement included tutoring in a black housing project in New Orleans in 1964, participating in the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, and doing voter registration work in South Carolina in 1966. Bill graduated from Cotter in 1962. From 1959 to 1991, Bill's father and brother operated Winona Industries at Front and Caramona Streets here in Winona. Let's welcome alum Bill. All right, thanks, students. Make sure that your cell phones are off and your attention is completely on these two gentlemen. Go ahead.
Okay, good morning, Cotter.
Good morning.
That was pretty good. Let's try it one more time. Good morning, Cotter.
Good morning.
All right, it's great to be here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. Where to begin? I'm sure sitting where you are sitting right now and listening to us talk about the civil rights movement was probably like when I was a high school student listening to my grandfather talk about World War I. Something that was so far distant in the past, you couldn't really make sure, who came first, who came second, what was going on in those olden days. Well, Bill and I are here to try to tell you something about what happened in the civil rights movement during the 1960s, something that we were both a part of, and something that has a very strong connection to your school. I first heard about Cotter School when I interviewed a veteran of the civil rights movement by the name of Phyllis Cunningham, woman in the dark glasses sitting there in Wakeland, Mississippi. Phyllis graduated from Cotter High School in 1957. She enrolled in St. Teresa's. She was a nursing student. She spent her 2 clinical years in Rochester and at the Mayo Clinic. And while she was there, she became part of an organization called the Young Christian Students. It was an organization dedicated to human rights and social change. While she was there, she organized an assembly where African American leaders came to the Mayo Clinic and talked about how when black patients came to Rochester, they couldn't stay in the local hotels. They had to stay in private homes where black doctors did not receive fellowships to the Mayo Clinic. And one hopes that things began to change as a result of what Phyllis did. Phyllis's daughter is here with us today. Where are you? Way, those of you down on the ground floor cannot see her, but she has joined us today. I'm so happy to finally meet you. Phyllis went to Mississippi in 1964. She worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was a nurse and helped provide health care to the desperately poor black people living in the state of Mississippi. She also worked for the Medical Committee for Human Rights, a group of doctors and nurses who advocated for improved health care. When the Civil Rights Law was passed and Medicare became a part of the health establishment, she helped to inspect and monitor Southern hospitals to break down the Jim Crow barriers between black patients and white patients. Phyllis lives in New York City today, and she continues to be an activist into her 1980s. I last met her. We were at a demonstration at the state capitol in Albany designed to halt solitary confinement in New York State prisons. She is a remarkable individual. Then Phyllis told me about Joe Morse. The next slide. Joe, you will see on the right in this picture, Joe graduated from Cotter in 1961. A little bit younger than Phyllis. He knew her family. She knew his family. He was interested in civil rights. He was a student at St. Mary's College. He was in the seminary. He was going to become a priest. And in 1964, he volunteered to go to Mississippi. He went to Meridian, Mississippi. Meridian, Mississippi was where Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney and Andrew Goodman were working before they were murdered in the summer of 1964. He worked registering voters. He worked integrating employment. He worked in the Head Start program in Mississippi. He came, eventually worked his way back to Winona, where he became an environmental advocate, among other things, a lifelong advocate for social justice. So I got these two people in Mississippi, and then I began to realize that they are not alone. There was Bill's class. So Bob Gillum, yourself,
Tom
Boland, and
Gene DeMore 1 year behind.
Gene DeMore. And I'm a sociologist, and I'm saying 6 white civil rights workers from this little town in Minnesota where there are almost no black people. How in the world did this happen? This was more than a coincidence. Something was happening at Cotter High School in the 1950s and the 1960s that created these people who were passionate about social justice and who were willing to work for social change. And that's what we're going to be doing here today. I am going to be interrogating Bill, but before I do that, I want to make a plug for a book. There are a couple of copies of this book I just donated to your library. If you want to learn about the civil rights movement, there are history books, but I recommend that you read this first. It's called Coming of Age in Mississippi. It was written by a young black woman who grew up in a small town in Mississippi, who experienced Jim Crow racism firsthand, who went to college and became an activist in the civil rights movement, and wrote this book at the age of 22 or 23 while she was still young enough to remember what it was like being a young person growing up in the state of Mississippi. This is, I think you will find it, a riveting story that you should read if you want to understand about the civil rights movement. Okay. Bill, what would you like to say before we begin this interrogation?
Well, I begin with a confession, which is I think I idealized Winona. I moved here in 1960 from Milwaukee, and I almost instantly made lifelong friendships. And I kind of fell in love with the hills and the river and the people in Winona. And so I tend to look back on it as a time that was absolutely perfect, and it wasn't. We were, my friends and I were goofy, and we got into little bits of trouble, and we did this thing and that thing. But it was a time that was very formative for us. We became essentially who we were going to be in life, and part of that was that we started little by little. We weren't terribly serious, but little by little reading books and talking about ideas. And I think one of the things about Cotter was that there was a sense that you had a calling in life, that there was something that you were meant to be and meant to do. And we talked to each other about what those things might be. And we influenced each other a great deal. And we all found our own ways, but we all found our ways into a calling that involved social service and treating people with respect and dignity and standing up for people who had been really treated badly.
So, Bill, we know you only lived in Winona for just a few years, and why do you think it had such a strong effect? I mean, you consider this to be your hometown, even though you only lived here for a very short time.
Well, I lived here for 2 years, but my family lived here for 40 years, and so I was back and forth to Winona almost my whole adult life. And I think the thing that was important was that even at Cotter, you might have expected if there's 6 of us doing this, and then there were others who were in the Peace Corps. One friend went to Nepal, and another to Malaysia, to Africa. And so there was a time of social service, and you might have expected, well, there must have been some charismatic teacher who was really into this and inspired us all. In fact, we hardly ever talked about social justice or civil rights or anything of that nature when we were at Cotter. And there was one particularly influential teacher, but it was more all in the nature, I would say, of laying the groundwork or foundation for our lives. That is, developing our values and taking things seriously, learning to think independently, and then talking among ourselves, not just about the fun things that we had to do, but also about the serious things in life, the deep things in life. And that's what, it was that foundation that we all shared that was really given to us at Cotter that was so important about it.
So, why don't you tell us how you first became aware of racial discrimination and civil rights? I know it's an interesting story.
Yeah. So, it's a story of friendship. I went to St. Thomas at college, and I became friends with a guy named Joe Gasper. Joe was African American. He was from New Orleans. And he was a very bright guy. He was a chemistry major, and we became friends. And I was looking for something to do. And as much as I loved Winona, I wanted to get out to see the big world. And I was turning, this was 1964, I was going to turn 20 that summer. And Joe told me about a project in New Orleans where he was from, tutoring in the Desire Street Housing Project, an all-black housing project. An interracial group of students would live together and do the tutoring together. And I thought, what a wonderful opportunity for service. And I also thought, New Orleans! Winona is all fine and good, but New Orleans, when you're 20 years old. was another kind of great opportunity. So I jumped for it. And I got on a bus downtown Winona, and I headed down the road, and it's a long trip in those days, and at dawn the next morning, I realized I was the only white person in the back of the bus. We were in Mississippi, and there was racial segregation in the buses, and we stopped at a roadside cafeteria, and I got out of the bus, and there it said, colored white. And there was a place in the middle where they made the food, and the colored, as they were called then, ate over here, and the toilets were over here, and the white were over here and over here. And I didn't know what to do. I hadn't been expecting a moral choice at 7 in the morning, and I had been riding the bus for nearly 24 hours at that point. And I compromised, and I ate on the white side and got back in the back of the bus. But the murders that Paul described were about 2 weeks after that in Mississippi, two white and one black civil rights workers. And I hadn't thought then, but I realize now that if I had made the other choice and gone to eat on the colored side, I might have been number 4. So it was a serious business. It hit me like that these people down there really meant that when they said colored and white, and you better pay attention. So I paid attention, and I spent that summer I didn't know black people in Winona, and living in an interracial group and tutoring black kids, playing basketball and football after hours, and it began to change my life. I learned more from them than I ever taught them about reading and arithmetic.
So the following year, you decided to go to Selma.
The following year, I went on the Selma March from Selma to Montgomery, which was for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it was, I think, the greatest single event in civil rights history, that and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it meant power. It meant that black people could vote where they couldn't vote, and there were enough black people in the South that the white politicians had to pay attention, and that there would soon be black politicians. And one of my friends, Bob Gilman, and I from Winona were on that march together.
So the following summer, you went to South Carolina, where you did voter registration. Let's go back to that previous.
Yes. So
Skinny fella up here on the left. That's Bill. How many years ago was that now?
Well, that was 1966, and that's a group of the people that worked together. And what it was is the Voting Rights Act was passed, and it was a very strong law, and it was a federal law, applied to all of the states. And if the local voting officials in any state didn't implement the law, then the federal government could put federal substitutes in to make sure that people were actually registered and that they could actually vote. But in order to vote, you had to get registered, and that meant encouraging and organizing people to go down to register to vote. So this was a group of about 15 college students, black and white. We lived together, and every day we would go out and we would knock on doors, and we would walk down the farm lanes, and we would go to the churches on Sunday and to the market on Saturday, where people would gather, and we'd say, it's really important that you register to vote, and try to persuade black people who were fearful for good reason that they should register to vote. We said we can arrange a ride, and we'd go down and we'd walk them up to the door where they would go in to register to vote. Also that they really could exercise their rights that they didn't have. In many of these counties, there might be 0 black people who were registered to vote before 1965, and by 1969 it might be 50 or 60%. And that's what we did. We worked together to help people and try to give them the courage to go and register to vote.
So many white people in the South resented the presence of Northern students like yourself.
Let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
Could you show? I want to show you what the places that some of the no, the other way. So these are the kids from the neighborhood where we live, and they love to come over and hang around and they were helpful to us because they had aunts and uncles and parents, and the younger generation was not as afraid, and they were active, and they could help us persuade. So we did a lot of working with the kids. Again, I played basketball and with the kids
You
too.
were probably the most interesting thing that was happening in town.
That's right. And here's what the South looked like in those days. This is the kind of houses we would go to out in the country. And the degree of poverty is something that you can hardly imagine now. And the poverty and isolation meant lack of power too. So that these are homes that you would not see any wires going into because there were no telephones, there was no television, there was no electricity in many of the homes in the country. And so these people were so isolated they might not have ever heard of the Voting Rights Act. And they were incredibly poor too. They were often sharecropping. And this is the kind of house that we went to and talked about, like some northern white civics teacher, about the importance of registering to vote. And fortunately, ours was an interracial group, so there were black college students who went with us too, and could help explain and give credibility to the people who lived in these homes about registering to vote.
So was there danger in the work that you were doing?
Let me say one other thing about before we go ahead and flip one. So here's, to me, a lot of these things are personal. The other friends who did civil rights work, Bill Gasper, who was a St. Thomas student who got me going to New Orleans. And this is one of the great men I've ever known, Ernest A. Finney Jr. And Finney was a lawyer in Sumter County, South Carolina, where we worked. And he did civil rights cases starting in the 50s at a time when it was incredibly dangerous to do anything like that. And he was one of the people who helped sponsor our project and helped us to understand what were the most effective ways of getting people to register to vote and so forth. And he was also the beneficiary of our work. So after we left Sumter, he ran for the state legislature. He lost the first time. He won the second time. So by the early 1970s, the Civil Rights Act had the effect that now a black man could be elected as state representative in a county where black people couldn't even register to vote just a few years earlier. But then Finney became a circuit court judge. Then he became a justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. And then he became the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. And none of that would have happened without the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and without black people taking advantage of the Voting Rights Act and registering to vote and actually voting and claiming political power. So Ernest A. Finney Jr. for me is he died a few years ago, was the embodiment of everything that was done in the civil rights movement and especially the Voting Rights Act part of it.
So you were doing voter registration work. Was there danger in that?
We were young and I won't say carefree, but I would say not fully aware of danger. And so when we would go out in interracial groups, we would get a lot of catcalls and nasty names and that kind of thing. But nobody ever actually assaulted us or anything. I don't think it was quite as bad as Mississippi where you were. So I got the feeling that it was getting near the end of the summer and things must be not so bad. So I persuaded the people who were running our project that some of us could go out in an interracial group one night and just do something that would be fun. Well, there weren't actually a lot of fun things to do in South Carolina, so we went bowling. There really wasn't much to do there. So we went to the Gamecock Lanes and we went bowling. And as we bowled, there was a crowd that formed, and I was, I guess, naive and unaware. I didn't quite realize what was going on. At any rate, when we got out into the parking lot, I was driving a car, and we were an interracial group, and there were 5 of us, and there was a mob. And they started yelling and approaching us, and we jumped in the car, and one of the people threw a brick into and broke the back window of our car. And so we started to drive off, and they formed a group of cars. It was a 4-lane undivided road, and they formed a group of cars before us, ahead of us, behind us, and started going about 3 miles an hour, yelling and throwing things. And then as we had gone a couple of miles, they formed an arc with the cars like this to force us off the road and down a dirt road that went into a deep forest and looked like it was going into a very bad place. And as it happened, one of them had not placed his car quite right, and he decided to move it to get the arc sealed. And when he did, I floored it, and we had a high-speed chase through downtown, running red lights, squealing tires, that sort of thing. And we got to the police station, and you might think that that was a safe haven, but the 3 young civil rights workers who had been murdered in Mississippi had been in the police station, and the police set them up to be murdered when they were released. So we really didn't know whether this was safety or a very much worse thing. So the police gave us a very hard time for disturbing the peace and that sort of thing. But they called the state troopers, and the troopers dispersed the mob, and they escorted us home and put a car outside our house that night. And I realized that my youthful enthusiasm about having a good time has been a little bit reckless.
So, you knew about Phyllis, you knew her family, her sister went to school with you. Joe was a year older than you were. Bob and Tom and Jean, you know, did they recruit you in a sense? Did they persuade you to join the civil rights movement?
Yeah, we all kind of went our own way and ended up in more or less the same thing. And so we didn't, none of us, I think Jean and Joe overlapped for like 3 weeks in Meridian, Mississippi, but we basically came to the same conclusion out of the same foundation, but we were in touch all the time. One of Bob and I were college roommates for a year, and I was back in Winona all the time. The rest of them all went to St. Mary's or St. Teresa's. And then there were these other friends who were in the Peace Corps, and we talked about it was a time of great change in the world, and it seemed to us that we had an opportunity to be part of changing things for the better.
Now, you mentioned one teacher in particular, Sister Jonathan.
Yes.
Why don't you explain how she influenced you?
She taught a course called Contemporary Literature that was a seminar, and we sat around in an oval, and every Friday we had to do a spot paper. And then she would say, and one of us would read, and then the others would comment. And it was very competitive and critical, and almost none of it was on social justice or the civil rights movement. There was one William Faulkner novel, that was it. And so it wasn't a kind of direct, straight line from that to civil rights. What it was a direct line to learning to think for ourselves. Because we were competitive with each other too. When somebody read the paper, we'd tell them what was wrong with it as well as what was right with it. And that learning to think for ourselves was really the foundation, not just for civil rights, but for my whole career as a lawyer. I think really began and again in a very indirect way. If somebody asked me the day I walked out of that class, what are you going to be? I would say, I was going to be a professor of English, like Sister Jonathan.
So, when you were at Cotter, you didn't learn about civil rights per se, but you learned how to think deeply, you learned how to think critically. Would you say that's the most important thing you learned at Cotter?
Yes, I would say that that's it. The other thing is that when we lived in Milwaukee, and the school I went to, Marquette University High School, there was a very good school. But it was the kind of place also where, among the student body, who was the best athlete, who was the best looking, who had the coolest clothes, who had the fanciest car, that was sort of what counted for status among the students. And people were very conscious of status, and it was an all-boys school. And if you had a physical disability or a speech impediment, God help you, you'd get a nickname that made fun of that kind of thing. And people were openly bullies, and you didn't even really quite notice that bullying was a bad thing. So there was all of this kind of thing that simply, in my experience at Cotter anyway, didn't happen. Nobody particularly cared whether you had a car, what you drove, or whether you had this kind of clothes or that kind of clothes. And I think that people who were susceptible to bullying in another environment simply weren't here. They were valued for who they were. And I think that that was a very important part of that, not just for the civil rights movement, but for life generally.
So some of you students who are seniors will be learning about the civil rights movement sometime in the spring towards the end of the American history class. Typically, it's crammed in because the teacher may have spent a little bit too long talking about some of the other things that happened before the civil rights movement, and you will learn about people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and John Lewis. But I think one of the things we would like you to understand is that you would never be studying about John Lewis or Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King if there had not been hundreds and thousands of other individuals who were working together with them, who made a movement possible. The people in the churches, the people who did not ride the buses in Montgomery, the people who stood in line for hours waiting to register to vote. They were the people who helped to make the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, put the pressure on Congress so that became law. And today we see that we're dealing with many of those very same issues. And certainly people from our generation are very concerned about it, but it's people from your generation who are going to make the difference in the years to come. And we hope that you will learn from the experience of people in the civil rights movement that major change is accomplished. But there's a saying, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And definitely that is never been more true than it is today.
The last thing I'd say is, when you were walking in, the footage up here was of the March on Selma, from Selma to Montgomery. And if we can get the video going at the end here, we're going to end with Martin Luther King giving the speech at the state capitol in Montgomery on the day that the march concluded with. And while they're getting it up, I'll just share one quick moment. As Bob Gill and his friend from Winona and I walked up the hill toward the capital of Montgomery, a little girl, a black girl, maybe 11 years old, named Ariadne, came running out, and she wanted to march with us. I don't know quite why, but she did. And we held hands, the three of us. She in the middle and the two of us in the end. And for me, that is an icon right up there with Ernest A. Finney and with Martin Luther King for what the civil rights movement meant to me.
I know you.
All right, students, first of all, let's give Paul and Bill a You had the opportunity today to see history come alive. I also really enjoyed, Bill, some of your comments about what Cotter was like when you graduated in 1962. And I really hope those things are still with us today, where how someone looks, or someone has a speech impediment or has stuff going on in their lives, that we're compassionate and that we care about the human being and not the status. And that's a beautiful thing that you said, and I want to make sure our students heard that loud and clear as well. But I really appreciate everyone's great attention today. You did a fantastic job. You really stepped forward as Cotter students and showed us the best of what Cotter's about. So thank you as well, students. And I also want to say hello to some of our retired faculty that are with us today. It's great to have you back on campus. Thank you.
You're asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will President plan the visions of men? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth preserved will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long. Because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. If that scaffold sways the future, behind the devil known standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends so subject. How long? Not long. Because my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's casting out the village where the weights of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I know you're asking today, how long will it take?
Any idea on dismissal? Mr. Costello, dismissing all of us? Or?
Yeah, we can dismiss all.
All right. Thank you, students.